Happy Easter, and welcome to the Dole Institute of Politics' 2021 spring semester, The Modern American City, Past, Present, and Future. I am Patrick Tuohey with the Better Cities Project, a fellow of the Dole Institute. For the past few weeks, we've discussed public policy challenges that are as old as city themselves, such as finances, housing, regulation, economic growth, and population trends. Today, we're going to discuss something that feels new, the gig economy. And while self-employment and work for hire is itself nothing new, the internet and smartphones have dramatically increased the ability for individuals to leverage their time and property. But across the country, in city councils and state legislatures, the technological platforms that have enabled the growth of the gig work have been viewed dimly. Today's panelists argue that not only is gig work growing, but it is seen as a positive development by workers and maybe helping to insulate the economy from the worst effects of COVID-19. They are Arun Sundararajan and Steve King. Arun Sundararajan is the Harold Price Professor of Entrepreneurship and a Professor of Technology, Operations, and Statistics at New York University's Stern School of Business. Arun wrote the best-selling book, The Sharing Economy, and has authored a number of studies on gig work. Steve King, who hails from Hutchinson, Kansas, is a partner with Emergent Research. Steve's current research and consulting is focused on the future of work and the rise of the independent workforce. For the past decade, Steve has been conducting annual surveys of independent workers, such as those in the gig economy. Gentlemen, thank you both for participating today. We at the Better Cities Project have been working our own research or conducting our own research into the gig economy and the role it's playing in municipal economies. We've cited both of your research in the paper, but I'm particularly frustrated with one of the things I found was that the definition, the standard, how we measure gig economy itself seems to be in flux. I want to ask both of you about this, but I'll start with Arun. Arun, help us understand what we mean by the gig economy and how does it relate to other accepted terms such as contingent work or independent work or contracting?
Well, first of all, Patrick, thank you for having me on your in your series. Seems like a fascinating series, and I'm delighted to be joining. I think that the gig economy is used as a term in a couple of situations. One is when when someone is talking about something that could be pretty familiar, non-employment work, freelance work, but wants to give it a more modern sounding flavor or sort of tech-related flavor, because the gig economy has sort of gained a lot of popularity as a phrase recently. But it's also used frequently to describe a new generation of platform-enabled freelance work or platform-enabled independent work. And by platform, I mean sort of a technology system like Amazon's or Airbnb's or Uber's that connects individuals who are running tiny businesses with customers who want their services. And so I've, over the last few years have gravitated towards using the term non-employment work to describe the phenomenon that is often referred to as the gig economy or as contingent work, because it isn't imposing either too narrow a definition on it or any sort of positive or negative connotation. Contingent often has a negative connotation to it. And so, I think we've spent a lot of time in the 20th century with the dominant form of work being employment, someone giving you a salary in exchange for your labor and talent. And what we're seeing happen, or what we've started to see happen over the last couple of decades, is a growth in alternatives to employment, arrangements that are not employment but are increasingly popular. And platform work is one of them. Just being a freelancer is another. And so I like to think of that universe as being the universe of non-employment work.
And because you wrote the book on the sharing economy, how does the gig economy differ from the sharing economy, if at all?
Well, there was a lot of debate when I chose the title for my book. I preferred the title "Crowd-Based Capitalism" actually because I think it most precisely defines what I wrote about. My publishers told me that I could write what I wanted inside the book, but when it came to the title and the jacket cover, they were in charge. And I'm happy, I mean, I'm sure the sharing economy sold a lot better than crowd-based capitalism. I'm a professor, not a branding expert. But I think the phenomenon there was the sharing dimension had to do with enabling a lot of micro entrepreneurship through providing an asset that either you had dedicated to other people's use or that you used yourself and wanted to make some money off of on the side. And so you live in your apartment, but you might have a spare bedroom that you want to share for money with people. You own a car, you want to rent it out to people when you're not using it. You have time on your hands in a car, you want to drive other people around. And so you're sharing your car in some way. So there are parts of the sharing economy, I think, that fall under the umbrella of non-employment work. All of the sharing economy falls under the umbrella of other ways of earning a living, in contrast with working for someone else. So you might not think of hosting on Airbnb as being part of the gig economy because it doesn't feel like a gig. It feels more like running a small business of your own. But for those people who do earn a living from it, it is another example of those arrangements of work that are different from what was the dominant form of the 20th century, full-time employment.
Steve, let me bring you in on this. You and I talked, gosh, maybe two or 3 years ago now about the definition, the standards used to measure the gig economy. And you were the first to brought to my attention the fact that the Bureau of Labor Statistics and McKinsey, they all differ about this. How do you define the gig economy or gig work? And are people coalescing around that definition, or are we still where we were a few years ago?
Well, we pretty much follow what Arun said. The broader sector, it's a very diverse set of segments within the people that are doing non-employee type labor, non-traditional employee type labor. And we've always referred to the gig economy, much like Arun said, as being related to the platforms, Uber, Lyft, and others, and getting work there. But what's kind of happened is more and more people now use the gig economy to refer to the entire freelance, include all freelancers and pretty much all non-employee labor. And so it's still very confusing. And unfortunately, it's still a problem from a research standpoint and from a communication standpoint, because everybody's still using different definitions and different terms. And so the BLS is Bureau of Labor Statistics, part of the Census Bureau, is still using a different set of definitions. Most people in industry use different set of definitions. So it's still a broad issue, but we refer to the gig economy as short-term gigs, usually platform-based. We use a term independent workers to cover sort of the entire range of non-employee labor. And we use that kind of interchangeably with non-employee labor.
Well, you make an excellent point. I've got a friend who's a handyman. Another is a CPA. They are both gig workers, certainly non-employment workers, but neither use a platform or would consider themselves part of the new technology. Steve, let me start with you, and then Arun, maybe you can jump in. How big is this, and is it growing? How fast is it growing? What are we talking about? And maybe the last part of that is, what is the best way to quantify its size and growth?
Well, there's a lot of estimates out there. That at the low end, the estimates are about 30 to 35 million Americans. The estimates range up to 80 million Americans are part of the gig economy, and a put that into perspective, right now there's about 145 million employed Americans. So the estimates range from sort of 20% of employment all the way up to over 50% when you get to, there are even some estimates in the 90 to 100 million range. It really depends on, oddly enough, your definition of work has a lot to do with it. And it used to be pretty easy to define work, but now different people have different definitions of work. So some estimates include babysitters and garage sales, whether you participate and sell things on Craigslist, even though if you're just trying to get rid of something, it means you've earned income. Taking surveys online gets included in some of the assessments. Our own research, we currently estimated at about 40 million, a little less, but we only consider people who report earning income from non-employee labor at least once a month in an average year, average at least once a month. If they're less than that, we don't include them. So it really does range. I think the important data in the end, the important thing to know about the data is it is obviously large. Even the low end estimates, it's still a very important segment of the economy. And it's been growing more rapidly than the overall labor force over the last couple of decades. Now, labor markets grow slowly. And so when I say it's faster than the overall labor force, it's still only growing. Our estimates are over the last decade, grew a little over 2% a year. That just happens to be 2.5 times faster than the labor force overall. And the other piece that's important to note is most of the people doing gig work, non-employee labor, however you want to define it, are doing it part-time, pursuing a passion or to supplement their income. People that are doing it full-time is a much smaller number. We estimate that at about 16 million. And that's actually pretty close to the BLS estimate, not far off from that. And most other sources have it at less than 20 million. And so it's not like the entire world is shifting and going to become full-time gig workers or independent workers and get the majority of their income from independent work. The majority of people are doing it to supplement their income.
I want to follow up on that idea of people using gig work to supplement. But first, Arun, how do you quantify the size? Is it the number of people? Is it the amount of money they are earning, their receipts? What's your best guess?
Well, I tend to focus on the number of people who earn all or part of their income from something other than employment. That's how I quantify non-employment work. And I have a very simple rule for, estimating accurately what the size of this is. I just follow the numbers that Steve generates. He's been studying this longer than anybody else. And, I think the Bureau of Labor Statistics has a problem, which is, I mean, it's in a challenging situation. I mean, I think the economists there realize that the work arrangements are changing rapidly, and that their surveys are not accurately picking up on the changes. However, the nature of the surveys that the BLS and the census run are such that they cannot change them radically, rapidly. Right. I mean, they need to sort of change them gradually in order to maintain continuity, because a lot of the value in the BLS numbers is being able to compare what's happening now with 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 20 years ago. And so, I don't have a lot of faith in how the BLS measures, non-employment work, because of the way that they word the questions. A lot of Uber drivers report themselves as being employees, even though they're not. A lot of Amazon sellers do the same because of the wording of the questions. So yeah, I would, I've looked at other sources as well, of course, and Steve's numbers seem to be the best that it's somewhere in that, like, close to 20 million, 15 to 20 million people who are relying on this full time, and a significantly larger number who are supplementing their income. Now, although it means that we are still in a employment economy today, I believe that that will not persist over the next 2 decades. I fully expect that a majority of the workforce in a couple of decades will be earning their money primarily through arrangements other than full-time employment. And I think that the advent of, or the economic shock that we have gone through on account of COVID-19 and the lockdowns and the shelter in place and the rise in unemployment will accelerate this trend, because it has forced companies to A, rethink how they organize their work, and B, embrace remote work. And both of these factors, reorganizing how you do things and getting comfortable with remote workers, both favor a shift away from full-time employment and towards non-employment works. I expect the growth numbers that Steve mentioned are probably going to rise in the next 5 to 10 years.
Steve, let me follow up with that just a little bit. We talked before about kind of the more well-known platforms like Uber and Lyft, DoorDash. In your research, how representative are those companies of the gig economy? What percentage of the people you work with are dealing with those platforms?
If you include sort of the online talent marketplace platforms, Fiverr, Upwork, there's actually about 350 of them in the knowledge worker space, and probably around 400 or at least in the US in the non-knowledge worker space. When you get to that, our studies show about 27% of full-time independent workers use a platform at least some of the time. Most of them don't report the platform as being their primary source of work. They report it as something where they get a secondary source of work. But about 20, so 1 in 4 roughly are using it. The people that we categorize as part-time, about 1 in 3 say that they're using a platform at least part of the time. So it's become a significant part of most independent workers / gig workers sources of work. So, and now when you get down to the ones that everybody knows about, Uber had about 800,000 drivers in the US active. Before the pandemic, they were down, the last time I looked 4 or 5 months ago, in the US about 500,000 were somewhat active. They will bounce back. Lyft had about 300,000. So big numbers for an individual company, but relatively small numbers compared to the economy. But you add up all of the online platforms and marketplaces, and the numbers get quite significant.
Arun, you talked about the disruption within companies and how they think of workers, how they think of the support for workers, whether it's an office downtown or people working from home. Certainly gig work, and I'm thinking of Uber and Lyft and even maybe Airbnb, got a lot of headlines because they were disrupting established services. I mean, St. Louis, for example, provided a great story of the taxi cab company who worked very hard to limit ride sharing completely in St. Louis. And I think they have a sympathetic story, which is they were required for so long to have a great deal of capitalization, to have insurance. They had a big employee workforce. And of course, that's expensive when you consider benefits and whatnot. And then all of a sudden, overnight, anyone with a car was a competitor to them. And so that is a disruption. And a lot of those existing services went to their city councils, their state legislatures, and lobbied against. Uber and maybe Airbnb have kind of come through this, but do you imagine we will see the same pushback every time there's a new tech platform, or are cities and states beginning to understand that, as you said, we are moving into a period of disruption and that they have to retool altogether? sorry, that's a big confusing question, but maybe you
Oh,
have
no.
some insight as to how policies are changing.
Absolutely. I mean, I like big, confusing questions because then I get to pick and choose which parts of them I answer. But yeah, certainly, I have been sympathetic of the level of disruption that many incumbents in the both the taxi cab industry and in the hotel industry have faced. The last 10 years have not been kind to either of these industries in terms of their incumbents. Part of this, yes, has to do with the fact that there was a different business model with a different capital structure, different costs, and the platforms introduced a much sort of asset lighter way for the platforms and lowered the barriers to entry. Um, Now, that, of course, is sort of the story of progress. It's difficult for the incumbents, and it's hard for them to adapt. But I do believe that in many cities around the world, the pushback was excessive, driven in part by either powerful lobbying groups or labor unions. I think the picture looks very different today. It's pretty clear that if you want sort of vehicle-based shared transportation in your town or city, that it's going to be provided predominantly through Uber and Lyft and platforms like them. I think especially post-COVID, Airbnb has rebounded a lot faster than the hotels because they know how to build trust in unfamiliar experiences, because they can sort of repurpose their infrastructure to move away from cities and towards towns. And because, there's just sort of a lot more flexibility that business model has. And as a consequence, it's going to be central for cities to embrace sharing economy models if they want to provide, adequate public transportation. Because people would prefer to ride in an Uber today than take mass transit because of COVID concerns. And if they want to start to attract tourism back, Airbnb policy is going to be central because a significantly larger fraction of travelers are looking for Airbnbs rather than going to hotels. And I'm not saying hotels are inherently less safe than Airbnb, just that you got a platform that has spent 10 years figuring out how to get people to trust things. And you got a set of companies that never really thought about how to do this one way or the other because everybody just trusted a hotel room. And it's pretty clear why one is winning over the other. So that's my long-winded way of saying I think the landscape today is one in which the smart cities are not resisting the platform-based models, but are cautiously embracing them, trying to integrate them into how the city is run, sharing regulatory responsibility. I hear stories every day of how Airbnb is responsible for tax collection and sort of compliance with whatever local laws exist. And so this is a huge shift from 5 years ago where they were seen as the protagonist in the regulatory drama rather than as a partner. But, bottom line, cities today are increasingly more friendly towards platform-based work and platform-based ways of providing transportation and accommodation, only because they have become so dominant and because they are the future.
Arun, along those lines, do you think cities are simply reacting to a new platform when it comes along, or are they actually, reducing regulation in anticipation of all the platforms that may come along in the future? I guess my question is, are they welcoming in a reactive fashion, or are they taking initiative?
I think it certainly shifted from a reactive to a proactive model. Certainly, if you go back to 2012 or 2013, the regulatory response to platform-based anything was very reactive and tended to be sort of slightly negative reactive. Today, on the other hand, it's much more forward-looking. Of course, it depends on the city. But for example, New York State is figuring out how to start to collect hotel tax from Airbnb hosts, start to use Airbnb as the agent through which that tax is collected, and is expanding its definitions and its regulations of sort of taxation of short-term accommodation, to include different situations that didn't exist 10 years ago but are now common because of Airbnb. So that's an example of a state that was very resistant to platform-based models initially, that is now sort of adapting and designing its regulations to accommodate them. So certainly, I mean, this has certainly happened in China, in South Korea, in other countries where the middle class is younger and people have embraced these platform models much more rapidly. But I certainly see it happening in the United States and Western Europe as well. So I would say right now it's probably at a tipping point, but tipping towards proactive and away from reactive.
Let me invite the audience, if you have questions, to email us at dolequestions@ku.edu. We will endeavor to get to as many of them as we have time for at the end of the segment. Steve, I want to talk to you a little bit about disruption, but this time on behalf of the employees of non-employer work or gig work. And certainly there's been a concern about businesses taking advantage of gig workers. For example, in California, there was an effort to make gig workers, contingent workers for Lyft and Uber into employees. And Lyft and Uber said that would be tremendously expensive, and were actually able to defeat that piece of legislation in a referendum last November. I understand Connecticut has been talking about something similar, and even there's discussion at the federal level of making gig workers considered employees. Your research has demonstrated that people, as you said earlier, are often working gig in addition to a full-time job where they may have benefits, and in fact, people are seeking out a gig work as a supplemental income. How has the disruption been on workers themselves, and how are regulatory agencies at the state or local level handling that?
Well, it's getting better. I would have said not well a couple of years ago. It's a really hard problem. One of the original lawsuits brought by workers against Uber went to court, and the judge in the end said, "This is a square peg in a round hole problem. Our laws simply don't allow for me to even rule on this." It was really interesting. He ended up siding with Uber in his decision, but it's a real challenge. Our existing regulatory framework doesn't handle this very well, and we've found in all of our surveys, whether we're no matter who we're surveying, whether it's the non-employee laborers in general or Uber and Lyft drivers, delivery drivers, the majority want to be independent contractors, but a pretty solid minority, depending upon which segment, anywhere 20 to 40% want to be employees. And so one of the issues that you face trying to regulate the gig economy is, how do we do regulations that do a better job of protecting those who genuinely need the protections and who should be, and who are misclassified and should be employees, without hurting the majority of the people who value the flexibility that comes with being an independent contractor or an independent worker. And so what we saw in California, AB 5 was a law that was passed that has a very tight classification rule called the ABC test, that basically ended up being interpreted, and we knew this would happen up front quite broadly, and immediately faced a backlash, because lots of people that the law wasn't actually designed to impact were being very negatively impacted. Jobs were being moved out of California. Companies were saying we weren't going to hire freelancers in California because of the test. And eventually we had a proposition passed that was sponsored by Uber and Lyft and the other delivery companies, a $200 million marketing effort. And they overwhelmingly won what's called Proposition 22, that kind of created effectively a middle ground for drivers, where they got some of the benefits of being an employee but didn't get most of them. And so overall, we're really struggling at a regulatory level with coming up with regulations that accomplish the goals of protecting those that need protecting, while still providing the freedom of independent work to those that value that. And different cities have taken different tacks, particularly around Uber and Lyft. Seattle passed a law that around their drivers that seems to be going pretty well, that provides some minimum wage guarantees and protects drivers from being kicked off the platforms in what they would consider unfair circumstances. And so we've seen some different experiments. Arun can probably talk about New York's kind of unique because they've always required a taxi license, even for Uber drivers, kind of unusual. But they've done some things. Connecticut, you're mentioning, is actually backed away from the stricter interpretation in terms of classification. They're now exploring a rule that would allow gig workers to collectively bargain. It's not clear that law would hold up in court relative to current federal law, but our federal government's also looking now something called the PRO Act, and classifying people like Uber drivers and a lot of different gig workers as employee just for collective bargaining purposes. It wouldn't cover. States are actually the level of government that decides for most purposes how a worker is classified. But for union rights and bargaining, the federal government law is the law. And so the PRO Act is being proposed by the Biden administration, and they've cleverly worked it into their infrastructure plan, which they're going to try to pass through reconciliation. And so they wouldn't need Republican support. We've all thought the PRO Act was dead on arrival because there is no Republican that support it. And there are a number of Democratic senators who do not support the PRO Act, but this is kind of a clever maneuver from a political standpoint. And those Democratic senators might go along with it as part of this broader bill.
So you talked about how it's very difficult to tease out traditional jobs versus work now, and that we have to regulate differently. Are there any cities or states, or maybe even proposals, Steve, that you think are promising as being examples of the right way to do it? And then Arun, I'd like to hear your answer to the same question.
Yeah, we've long been against a third way to classify workers. We've always felt that it would just cause more trouble than it's worth from a legal standpoint. Worker classification laws are challenged in court all the time. I'll tell you, it's great to be a labor lawyer in today's world. You've got kind of unlimited work opportunities. And so we've always felt, gosh, if you added a third level of classification, something that was in between being fully independent and being a regular employee, that would just add to more trouble. But given the way things are going, we're now much more supportive of that. And just recently in the UK, Uber recognized Uber drivers as workers, which is a third level of classification that gives them some benefits of traditional full-time employment under the UK system, but not all of them. But gives them more benefits than if they were classified as they were before as independent contractors. And so we're now seeing in California, we kind of have a third way because of Prop 22. There are third way discussions going on in a number of states. And while, as I said, we've never been in favor of that, we've now come around and think that if we could, it might be a good way forward for all states. It's kind of where we're at. Actually, we have never talked to Arun about this. What's your view on this, Arun? Push the problem off.
Sure. I think that there's mean, what Proposition 22, which Steve, you've laid the groundwork for me to be able to sort of discuss, what I feel about these different things sort of very nicely. So thank you for that. I wish that Proposition 22 or some variant of it was what had been proposed by the legislature, perhaps with slightly more generous benefits. Because the structure that it creates is promising. I've had the same concerns about a third way that you have, Steve, because, in my mind, it creates two gray areas rather than one. And then I sort of look at my job as a professor and I'm like, am I a full-time employee, or, would I be an independent worker if we had a third way or a fourth way? But I think it really comes down to, and the reason why I like what Proposition 22 put in place was a few features. I mean, one, it did not require you to be an employee in order to get benefits. And so the sort of two-class system, it was a step away from that. And so while maybe the 20% of Uber drivers who drive 50, 60 hours a week were unhappy with it, as you mentioned, a vast majority of drivers who probably would have lost their livelihood had AB5, stuck on, were happy about it. It also starts to create a funding structure for extending benefits and protections to people who are not employees. And to me, eventually, the answer to, the classification is a means to an end, right? In the end, that largely workers and individuals are looking for are benefits and protections. And the challenge is that we've got funding mechanisms for benefits and protections. If you're an employee, we don't have well-developed funding mechanisms for benefits and protections if you're not. And so this rush to classify everybody as employees, when in fact what legislatures might actually want to do is create infrastructures for funding benefits and protections. And to me, the forward-looking way is to be bold, as to say, I'm not going to, take the easy way out and try and stuff everybody into the employee category by refining some sort of somewhat antiquated set of tests. I am instead going to go out on a limb and, create ways to sort of establish a wage floor for people who are not employees. Look carefully at how collective bargaining and other organizing rights can be imparted to all workers, not just employees. Create mechanisms by which, if there's a large institution like a platform that plays a significant role in getting the worker their work or getting the business their work, then they have some funding obligation towards contributing towards a benefit pool. And so these are the structures that are going to be essential in 20 years, because a majority of the workforce isn't going to qualify for benefits under laws that were created for employees. So to me, Proposition 22 wasn't just good for Uber drivers and DoorDash delivery people. It was the first step in sort of imagining what a funding infrastructure for benefits might look like in the future when we have a significant fraction of the workforce being non-employment workers. And there's one final dimension of Proposition 22 that I liked. My own research has suggested that people's aspirations for benefits and protections vary widely depending on what stage of life they're in, and just simply based on preference. I mean, some freelance workers want some mechanism by which their income is stabilized. Others want something that gives them the equivalent of a paid vacation. Others are thinking about their retirement. Others want contributions towards making healthcare more affordable. And the Proposition 22 design is one in which you are getting money that can be put towards the benefits that you choose, rather than saying that everybody is going to get retirement or everybody is going to get income stabilization. And so it's a step towards recognizing that the benefits needs of the future are going to be different and more diverse than the benefits needs of the present, and a one-size-fits-all solution, even if we move away from attaching it to employment, isn't really going to serve everybody's needs. I mean, Steve, you and I have discussed another dimension of the safety net of the future, which is that, as we move away from a world in which people work as employees for large companies, the individual is bearing a different set of risks. And we saw this in, when the pandemic hit. I mean, Hertz filed for bankruptcy because, they had leases on hundreds of thousands of cars that, were not generating any revenue, and they had to cover the costs. Uber did not come anywhere close to filing for bankruptcy. And this wasn't just because of Uber Eats. It was also because Uber's risk profile is different. They don't hold the assets. The Uber driver is holding a fraction of the risk that the company used to hold. And the same is true for Airbnb, the platform, and the Airbnb host versus a hotel and its workers. And so, in addition to thinking about how do we fund benefits and protections, I think the government also needs to rethink its risk management strategies and its risk management interventions. We have bankruptcy protection, which is an important intervention, but it's designed for large companies. And we need to sort of go beyond thinking about unemployment benefits as the protection for the individual in response to a low frequency, high impact event. So again, bringing it all back to which approaches do I like? There's no city that has come up with the ideal approach, unfortunately. But had the California legislature come up with their version of Proposition 22, I'd have probably been pointing to that as the exemplar for everybody else.
Mm-hmm.
It's amazing, Arun, to your point. We provide benefits for so many people through the employer. As employment changes, we're going to have to retool to make sure that the workers get those protections. Let me talk a little bit in our last few minutes about COVID. Arun, you published a paper on the effect of, I think it was Uber Eats on restaurants. Can you talk a little bit about why you took on that project and what you found?
Well, I took on the project because, it struck me that, at a time when people were unable to go to the places that they normally went to, whether it was a grocery store or a restaurant, in order to sort of give that establishment their business, that they would rely increasingly on digital platforms to reach these local physical world businesses. And as a consequence, the platforms themselves were going to become a central part of the resilience of the small businesses. That is, the restaurants or the mom and pop store, the sort of the focused grocery store that had a platform presence, that had some sort of channel to their customer that was digital. These would be the businesses that survived and thrived, while the other businesses would sort of be hit a lot harder. And so I was very interested in understanding, in the context of restaurants, because the data was more easily available, whether access to a platform conferred digital resilience and the extent to which it did. Because for a lot of small businesses, setting up your own e-commerce operation, creating a direct digital channel to your customers all by yourself is all but impossible. If you're a coffee shop and you rely on foot traffic, I mean, you've got to set up a website. Yes, there is Shopify now that can help you do that, but then you've got to sort of generate the demand. And so to me, the future of digital business for small businesses seems to be the platform model through Uber Eats, through DoorDash, through Amazon, through other players. And what we did find was that the survival rate for restaurants that were on the platform was significantly higher, that the demand increases were much greater than we expected. And this was, April of 2020. So we had no idea whether people would trust platform-based delivery enough, to actually be ordering from their restaurants, whether they could reach the grocery stores, on foot. And so maybe they're ordering from restaurants because they can't prepare their own food. And so all of that put together seemed to yield a short-term result that there was a big spike in the total volume of orders that went to restaurants on the Uber Eats platform. What was really interesting was that this happened despite the restaurants cutting their operating hours and despite a significant fraction of restaurants shutting down entirely. And so the restaurants that remained actually saw dramatic increases, more than a doubling of the order velocities that were coming in. But to me, the motivation was to show that platforms are central to small business resilience, and at least to sort of contribute to the narrative that, these platform-based models are not just important for, sort of for gig work or for long distance retail like Amazon is. They are a central part of a city's sort of infrastructure and resilience, especially, in times of economic shock.
So my hypothesis would be right along with that is that businesses or cities that have more permissive regulations of platform or gig work would better survive the COVID and the economic lockdowns. Is there any sign that that's the case? Maybe a subsequent research or researchers in the field, and if there isn't, what signs might we look for to suggest that that is true? Again, that cities with more permissive regulation for these platforms are outperforming cities that have acted to shut them all down.
Ooh.
Well, I think that I've got some very early evidence that as tourism returns, I'm sort of tracking tourism using foot traffic data and trying to understand how many people are visiting a place who are not from that place. And there is sort of very preliminary evidence that cities with more permissive Airbnb regulations are seeing higher levels of tourism than you would have expected, because a lot of the accommodation choices now have shifted away from hotels and towards Airbnb. I haven't seen anything, and I haven't done any work myself on understanding whether this is true of food delivery or of transportation, although my hypothesis is that it certainly will be the case for transportation. In France, the platform BlaBlaCar, which offers sort of city-to-city transportation, sort of like buying a train ticket, except that you're buying a seat in someone else's car. And it's, it's not present in the United States, but it's very popular in France and Germany. And as it turns out, Russia and Brazil, 20% of Russia's population is on the BlaBlaCar platform. That there's evidence that those platform-based models of travel have returned much more rapidly than the plane or the train-based models of transportation. And so, I think this would be further evidence that cities that are more accommodating of that form of transportation are going to see sort of a greater inflow of tourism. I think the broader point to take away here is that when a city is planning its infrastructure, it's important to think beyond physical infrastructure and high fixed cost infrastructure. Cities tend to think about roads, and physical infrastructure clearly is important, but you have to go beyond thinking about building a light rail system as your infrastructure project, and instead think about what kind of platform policy and what kind of sort of platform enablers can I create to make that kind of infrastructure more central to how people in my city live. Because this kind of invisible infrastructure that can turn on and off depending on if there's a demand spike, more cars come on the road, more Airbnb hosts sort of offer up their platforms, offer up their homes, more BlaBlaCar drivers are sort of offering up seats. If there's a lockdown, then it sort of naturally ebbs and flows with sort of demand. This kind of infrastructure is the infrastructure of the future. And so setting up both sort of in terms of accommodation and transportation infrastructure, thinking about platforms but also thinking about the local delivery infrastructure as being an important gateway for small businesses. And as important, if not more important than foot traffic, is a mindset shift that city planners have to go through, because it's not just the infrastructure for tourists or for transportation, it's also the infrastructure for all of your businesses now. And so rather than letting the platforms design the rules around this infrastructure entirely by themselves, it would be good if a city was proactive about saying, here's how I support my small businesses by giving them better gateways to platforms, by sort of making sure that the revenue share between the platform and the small business is sufficiently equitable, and so on.
I've seen some promising stories about cities that are using a ride sharing to provide paratransit for handicapped passengers. And again, it suggests that cities are more than being hostile, are now looking at it and saying there's an opportunity for us to provide basic services. Steve, you've been in the field during the pandemic with your study of independent workers. I'm curious to know if you were able to collect information about attitudes towards independent work during COVID. I would guess that more people are doing more of it, or at least thinking of it more often. What have you found?
It's interesting. Early in the pandemic, everybody, the economy tanked. Everybody was hurt, including independent workers, and there just wasn't as much opportunity out there. And so the number of independent workers did fall early on. What we've been seeing since last fall is a pretty rapid growth in people starting out being independent workers, new gig workers, new freelancers. There's a statistic the tax statistics. It's an EIN number. It's referred to as business applications, but it's really a tax ID number. And the number of people who are saying that they're going to be solopreneur businesses, meaning that they're going to be gig workers of some form, they're not planning on employees. Those applications are more than double what they normally are, and it started off late in the fall and it's continued, and the numbers are still extremely high through the latest data in February. And so we've definitely seen an expansion. In a lot of cases, that's again supplemental income. A lot of people have needed additional sources of income due to the pandemic. They've either have their hours cut or fully laid off. But the numbers in terms of people that are saying, I want to do this full time or start an employer small business have also skyrocketed. And so definitely at the back half, we've seen of last year going into this year, we've seen strong growth. The platforms themselves are reporting a lot more interest. If you look at Fiverr or Upwork in the knowledge work areas, they've had an explosion of people joining their platform to do work. They've also seen their business grow quite rapidly. And the Ubers and the Lyfts and those platforms have also seen an influx of people coming in. And our current forecast for the next couple of years is for quite strong growth, much stronger than we've seen in the last decade in the growth of independent workers or gig workers, or we get back to, it's hard to know what to call them, both full-time and part-time. So yeah, the initial reaction to the pandemic was not good. The good news was we did have the pandemic unemployment insurance, the first time non-employees could get unemployment insurance, which was a great security benefit for non-employee labor, and one that we've never had before, and a great example of benefits being extended and our safety net being extended to people that aren't traditional employees. So it went down a little bit in the first half of last year, started to come back, and it's coming back strong right now.
I don't know that your survey asks people about their income, what they're making, but I imagine listening to you, when more and more people rush into these platforms, the hours available to them go down. I imagine their earnings go down. Are there must be a group of people who get in all excited and then find out the market just isn't what it was maybe a few years ago and then exit. Is that substantial, or are people just happy to have any additional income?
Well, it's interesting. Churn rates are quite high on the platforms, particularly the platforms that support lower skilled workers, and so the Ubers and the Lyfts. They do face a high churn rate. People either don't achieve their goals or find it too difficult, and so yes, that they do see that. Interestingly enough, the people that are supplementing their income usually have sort of a daily target, and they're not so focused on their per hour earnings or even their earnings over costs. They've got a specific need to make X dollars that day. I've got a bill I have to pay. I've got rent that I have to pay, or something along those lines. And those folks continue to do it, even if the income goes down. They just work a little longer. We do ask a lot of questions in our surveys around income. Income's reliability of that data, survey data, is not great. People don't remember their income or don't want to say what their income is or make it up. But we do ask a lot of questions, and there is in the Uber world, there is an ongoing complaint that average incomes have fallen over the years. The studies, actually, including ours, don't necessarily fully reflect that. It has fallen from the very early years, but not in the last couple of years. But it is a question that's often raised, or will as more people join the platforms, won't prices naturally fall? And we've seen some evidence that it does and some evidence that it doesn't. So I think that the jury's still out on that one.
A last question for you, Steve. Is there any evidence that people will move in and out of a municipality based on that city's view of gig work? So, for example, I can imagine people would be more inclined to buy a house that they plan to use for short-term rental in a city where that was actually favorably regulated, as opposed to a place with maybe high costs or high permitting. But is there any, and maybe a ride sharing, maybe you drive across a political boundary into a city that has more permissive, but is there any indication yet that people are actually choosing where to live, say picking up and moving to Florida, for example, to pursue gig work, or are we still pretty much just trying to find what works in the places where we already live?
Well, there are a number of cities who seem to believe that, because they're off, like Tulsa, Oklahoma is offering incentives for gig workers to come move to Tulsa. New Hampshire's there's a couple towns in New Hampshire. There's recently a few other towns. So there's several cities who believe that that's true. I haven't seen any studies that could disaggregate it that much. We did a study a few years ago looking at knowledge workers, independent knowledge workers, so gig workers doing knowledge work. And the cities that, a number of cities were trying to attract them, but also they were congregating more in cities where there were more opportunities. Now that correlates also with tech. But a city like Chattanooga, Tennessee, intentionally went about trying to attract knowledge workers in general, and as part of that did attract a lot of independent knowledge workers, which has helped their efforts to become a more technology savvy city. So I haven't seen any specific studies on that, but there has been examples of where that is true.
We've reached the end of our hour. Let me thank both my guests, Arun Sundararajan of the New York University Stern School of Business and Steve King of Emergent Research. I'm very grateful for your time, and I think the discussion about jobs versus work and what the next 20 years holds makes me realize this is only going to become a bigger and more important topic. So I'm grateful for this discussion. Please join us next week, April 7, for our last session of the semester. We'll be discussing urban poverty with Angela Rashidi of the American Enterprise Institute, where she studies poverty and the effects of federal safety net programs, and Jesus Garena of the Family Independence Institute, an organization that invests in low-income families, allowing them to move themselves out of poverty. Thank you very much, and happy Easter.